Good morning. We are going to look at your textbook today. Give me 1 second and we'll get started. So topic 12, absolutism and the revolution. Essential question, how much power should the government have? So here's the execution of Marie Antoinette during the French Revolution, okay, the guillotine, enduring understandings, absolute monarchs such as Louis XIV of France exert complete authority over their kingdoms. England developed a limited monarchy with a written constitution. Enlightenment philosophers applied reason to political, social, and economic problems, and ideas such as natural rights shaped the American Revolution and the US Constitution. An unequal social system sparked the French Revolution, in which the monarchy was replaced by a republic. As Emperor of France, Napoleon Bonaparte began a series of wars that had lasting effects on Europe and the Americas.
The Palace of Versailles in France is home to some of the most spectacular architecture, gardens, and art in the world. It is a lasting symbol of Louis XIV, the king who lived there and ruled his country for over 72 years. Louis XIV ascended to the throne in 1643 at the age of 5. Because Louis was too young to rule, his mother, Anne of Austria, was named regent to rule in his name. She requested that his father's chief minister, Cardinal Jules Mazarin, remain in charge of the country. It was a time of unrest in France as the monarchy sought to centralize its power at the expense of the noble class, leading to a series of civil wars between 1648 and 1653 called the Fronde. After Mazarin died in 1661, Louis chose to rule alone and further consolidate his power. Louis believed in the divine right of kings, that the king's right to rule came directly from God and could not be bound by the will of the people, the aristocracy, and in some cases, the church itself. He was influenced by the writings of his childhood tutor, Bishop Jacques Bossuet. Bossuet wrote of kings, "He is a public personage. All the state is in him. The will of all the people is included in him. As all perfection and all strength are united in God, so all the power of individuals is united in the person of the prince." Louis conveyed this concept with this simple phrase, "L'état c'est moi," translated as "the state is me." To cement his absolute power, Louis transformed Versailles, a hunting lodge outside of Paris, into an immense palace of great opulence that would become a center for art and culture. In 1682, he ordered the court and the government to move to Versailles permanently and made it a home for thousands of nobles and officials. At Versailles, Louis used a series of tightly controlled rituals and ceremonies to keep the nobles vying for his favor instead of battling him for power. He also had them spend a significant amount of time every year at Versailles to prevent them from developing their own regional power. Louis referred to himself as the Sun King because he believed his subjects revolved around him the same way the planets revolved around the sun. Louis XIV placed tariffs on imported goods, fostered overseas colonies, and regulated trade. Under his leadership, France became the richest nation in Europe. Foreign dignitaries who visited Versailles were often intimidated, yet inspired by the tremendous display of wealth and power. During Louis's reign, France waged war against several European nations, running up tremendous debts. Combined with the costs of maintaining Versailles, the economy was left on the brink of financial ruin. When Louis XIV died in 1715, his form of absolute rule had brought stability to the nation, turning France into a world power and unleashing an era of art and culture that is still celebrated.
Okay, absolute monarchies in Spain and France. We're going to skip that yeah, ruling with absolute power, we are going to skip that. We are going to go to the French Revolution, wherever it is. Okay. Where are you? Right here. Yes, the French Revolution begins.
6. The French Revolution begins. Objectives. Describe the social divisions of France's old order. Trace the causes of the French Revolution. Identify the reforms enacted by the National Assembly, including the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Key terms. Ancien régime. Estates. Bourgeoisie. Deficit spending. Louis XVI. Jacques Necker. Estates General. Cahiers. Tennis Court Oath. Bastille. Faction. Marquis de Lafayette. Olympe de Gouges. Marie Antoinette.
Okay, so starting with the old regime in France.
The old regime in France. On April 28, 1789, unrest exploded at a Paris wallpaper factory. A rumor had spread that the factory owner was planning to cut wages, even though bread prices were soaring. Enraged workers vandalized the owner's home and then rioted through the streets. The rioting reflected growing unrest in Paris and throughout France. In 1789, France faced not only an economic crisis, but also widespread demands for far-reaching changes. By July, the hungry, unemployed, poorly paid people of Paris were taking up arms against the government, a move that would trigger the French Revolution. In 1789, France, like the rest of Europe, still clung to an outdated social system that had emerged in the Middle Ages. Under this ancien régime, or old order, everyone in France belonged to one of three social classes, or estates. The first estate was made up of the clergy. The second estate was made up of the nobility. And the third estate comprised the vast majority of the population. First estate, the clergy. During the Middle Ages, the Church had exerted great influence throughout Christian Europe. In 1789, the French clergy still enjoyed enormous wealth and privilege. The Church owned about 10% of the land, collected tithes, and paid no direct taxes to the state. High church leaders such as bishops and abbots were usually nobles who lived very well. Parish priests, however, often came from humble origins and might be as poor as their peasant congregations. The First Estate did provide some social services. Nuns, monks, and priests ran schools, hospitals, and orphanages. But during the Enlightenment, philosophes targeted the church for reform. They criticized the idleness of some clergy, the church's interference in politics, and its intolerance of dissent. In response, many clergy condemned the Enlightenment for undermining religion and moral order. Second Estate, the nobility. The Second Estate was the titled nobility of French society. In the Middle Ages, noble knights had defended the land. In the 1600s, Richelieu and Louis XIV had crushed the nobles' military power, but had given them other rights, under strict royal control. Those rights included top jobs in government, the army, the courts, and the church. At Versailles, ambitious nobles competed for royal appointments, while idle courtiers enjoyed endless entertainments. Many nobles, however, lived far from the center of power. Though they owned land, they received little financial income. As a result, they felt the pinch of trying to maintain their status in a period of rising prices. Many ambitious nobles came to hate absolutism and resented the royal bureaucracy that employed middle-class men in positions that once had been reserved for them. They feared losing their traditional privileges, especially their freedom from paying taxes. Third Estate, from middle class to peasantry. The Third Estate was the most diverse social class. At the top sat the bourgeoisie, or middle class. The bourgeoisie included prosperous bankers, merchants, and manufacturers, as well as lawyers, doctors, journalists, and professors. The bulk of the Third Estate, however, consisted of rural peasants. Some were prosperous landowners who hired laborers to work for them. Others were tenant farmers or day laborers. Among the poorest members of the Third Estate were urban workers. They included apprentices, journeymen, and others who worked in industries such as printing or cloth making. Many women and men earned a meager living as servants, construction workers, or street sellers of everything from food to pots and pans. A large number of the urban poor were unemployed. To survive, some turned to begging or crime. Widespread discontent. From rich to poor, members of the Third Estate resented the privileges enjoyed by their social betters. Wealthy bourgeoisie families in the Third Estate could buy political office and even titles, but the best jobs were still reserved for nobles. Urban workers earned miserable wages. Even the smallest rise in the price of bread, their main food, brought the threat of greater hunger or even starvation. In 1775, before the French Revolution, peasants rioted over the high price of bread in an event called the Flour War. Because of traditional privileges, the First and Second Estates paid almost no taxes. Peasants were burdened by taxes on everything from land to soap to salt. Though they were technically free, many owed fees and services that dated back to medieval times, such as the corvée, which was unpaid labor to repair roads and bridges. Peasants were also incensed when nobles, hurt by rising prices, tried to reimpose old manor dues. In towns and cities, Enlightenment ideas about equality led people to question the inequalities of the old regime. Why, people demanded, should the first two estates have such great privileges at the expense of the majority? Throughout France, the Third Estate called for the privileged classes to pay their share. Contrast. How did the lives of the Third Estate differ from the lives of clergy and nobles?
So how did the lives of the Third Estate differ from the lives of the clergy and nobles? If you're paying attention, hopefully you are. The Third Estate not only is the largest, but the majority of them are the poor working class. And they pay almost all of the taxes compared to the first and second, who pay almost none. Ooh, France's economic crisis. Okay, hang on one second.
France's economic crisis. Along with social unrest, France faced economic woes, especially a mushrooming financial crisis. The crisis was caused in part by years of deficit spending. This occurs when a government spends more money than it takes in. A nation in debt. Louis XIV had left France deeply in debt. The 7 Years' War and the American Revolution strained the treasury even further. Costs generally had risen in the 1700s, and the lavish court soaked up millions. To bridge the gap between income and expenses, the government borrowed more and more money. By 1789, half of the government's income from taxes went to paying the interest on this enormous debt. To solve the financial crisis, the government would have to increase taxes, reduce expenses, or both. However, the nobles and clergy fiercely resisted any attempt to end their exemption from taxes. A crumbling economy. Other economic woes added to the crisis. A general economic decline began in the 1770s. Then, in the late 1780s, bad harvests set food prices soaring and brought hunger to poorer peasants and city dwellers. Hard times and lack of food inflamed these people. In towns, people rioted, demanding bread. In the countryside, peasants began to attack the manor houses of nobles. Failure of reform. The heirs of Louis XIV were not the right men to solve the economic crisis that afflicted France. Louis XV, who ruled from 1715 to 1774, pursued pleasure before serious business and ran up more debts. The next king, Louis XVI, was well-meaning but weak and indecisive. He did wisely choose Jacques Necker, a financial expert, as an advisor. Necker urged the king to reduce extravagant court spending, reform government, and abolish burdensome tariffs on internal trade. When Necker proposed taxing the first and second estates, however, the nobles and high clergy forced the king to dismiss him. As the crisis deepened, the pressure for reform mounted. The wealthy and powerful classes demanded, however, that the king summon the Estates General, the legislative body consisting of representatives of the three estates, before making any changes. No French king had called the Estates General for 175 years. They feared that nobles would try to recover the feudal powers they had lost under absolute rule. To reform-minded nobles, the Estates General seemed to offer a chance of carrying out changes like the ones the English had achieved through the Glorious Revolution. They hoped to bring the absolute monarch under the control of nobles and guarantee their own privileges. Describe. What were some of the main reasons France was in serious economic trouble in the late 1700s?
Okay, if you, again, are paying attention, what were some of the main reasons France was in economic trouble? It mostly discussed it right in the beginning, okay? Years of deficit spending, and then here's a chart that discusses by 1788, France's royal treasury was deeply in debt, while people were paying higher prices for food and other goods. These charts illustrate the dire economic conditions of pre-revolutionary France. Okay, also in there was the American Revolution. France went into debt, helping the colonists rebel against Great Britain. Okay, so there you go. Crops, 7 years. The 7 Years' War was also known as the French and Indian War, in the American Revolution, helping out what is now the United States, and essentially crops. Poor harvest also contributed to the debt. Okay, that's where we're going to stop today, and we will pick up more on Monday. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. See ya.